we also have other modules like news and updates, legal news and updates. We have webinars, we have courses, and we also indulge ourselves in all the competitions and various other activities. So it's a very fine platform for students who want to learn the practical aspects of things, who want to hone their writing skills and researching skills, of course, and for the lawyers to network and get acquainted with many other experts and also have their queries resolved. So there are many categories in the forums which you can participate in and get along with the other experts. So I'll be giving it over to Akshat now from JKGA Chambers. He will introduce Mr. Shishodia, and we will start with the session in about 10 to 15 minutes so that we can have a full room and everyone can learn from Mr. Shishodia. Over to you, Akshat. You're not audible, Akshat. You're muted right now.
Sorry, am I audible for everyone?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So as Raghav rightly said, we've organized this session generally together, and we're very thankful to Mr. Shishodia for taking his valuable time out today to sort of share his views on judicial review and generally take us through like a fun talk on what it could be like if some landmark cases hadn't really gone the way that they did. And to introduce myself, I am a partner at JKGA Law Chambers. We're a small firm based out of Delhi. We practice across all specters and areas of law. We do everything from disputes to corporate taxation, labor and employment, everything. And just to introduce Mr. Shishodia, before we start the session, Sir is a senior advocate who's been practicing in the Supreme Court for a while now, approximately since the last 30 years, after brief stints in the Bombay High Court and in the Rajasthan High Court, in the chambers of Mr. G.E. Vahanwati, who you may know as the former Solicitor General and the Attorney General of India. Now, in Delhi, he was a junior of and also closely associated with Mr. Ashok Desai, who's also a former Solicitor General and Attorney General of India. He worked with him for a long time, and he dealt with several important constitutional cases at that time, whether representing the government or against the government, as the case may have been. Some notable cases that he's done are the fact that he's represented one of the petitioners in the Justice Loya case. He was present in the Aruna Shanbhag case as well as the ND Tiwari DNA case of 2011. Now, this webinar, we organized it, so that to continue the dialogue between people within and outside law, whether young practitioners or people who have enough experience, generally to explore basic themes of law and some very important sort of decisions and principles of law. We'll just wait. So we see that Sir has already joined the session, but we'll wait for approximately another 8 to 10 minutes just to get the full room, and then we will begin the session. In the meantime, I'd just like to sort of ask any of the participants who are willing to generally give us an idea of what they think judicial review is, what the courts do, what their powers are in such an instance, etc. Anyone?
Akshat, can't hear you.
Tanya, you've been unmuted. Do you want to answer the question? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just in simple terms, looking at and reviewing, as the word says, decisions that have been made by a court, and I guess like looking at the lawfulness and the fairness of the decision, going back to it. Yeah.
Perfect. Just to take on from there, I believe that Vivek, he's saying that, yeah, Vivek has messaged me. He's saying that judicial review is the power conferred upon constitutional courts to check the constitutionality of the executive orders or decisions, etc. He is absolutely correct, and Tanya, you were also correct in saying that it is the court's power to review the fairness and the constitutionality of a decision or of the of the law passed by the legislature. Having just sort of quickly covered the basics of what it is, I think we'll let Sir start And, over to you, sir. Would you like to start now?
Good afternoon, everybody. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Yes, sir, you're audible.
So, I'm very thankful to Lawyers Club of India. I'm also very thankful to Rahul and Akshit for organizing this wonderful webinar. In fact, I'm learning a lot about the new technology and how to talk to your generation of young and very enthusiastic people. And I must also acknowledge the simple terms the judicial review was described by one of the participants here just now, that it is the judgment or the judicial determination of by a constitutional court of the legislative enactment, including a constitutional amendment, and the executive action. And we are talking of this judicial review and the constitutional choices the court make. Now, you would find that over the period, the courts make constitutional choices in course of judicial review by reiterating earlier position, sometimes reversing the earlier position, and sometimes just remaining ambiguous and equivocal about the constitutional position, but deciding the controversy in hand only. Now, at the outset, I must make one very important disclaimer that we are not here to discuss about the correctness or the error in a given judgment or any series of judgments. We are not here to pass any value judgment because that's a very different kind of debate when you come to the contemporary issues like privacy or these 377, etc. So we are not on the pros and cons of the judgments, recent or the past judgments of the Supreme Court. And idea is also not to dwell here on the reasons that why judges depart or change their earlier views. Maybe they change because of the social values which change. Maybe they change because of the criticism, or maybe the experience, or maybe some other reason. But we are not on those also. Now, these are two important disclaimers because we are not here to discuss or criticize the judgments or the underlying ideas behind the judgment. We are discussing here the process of judicial review and the constitutional choices the courts make and how they change and how they are ever so dynamic. And in that sense, the judicial review is a very dynamic process. It's very fungible. It can go either way, as we will see with respect to some of the prominent instances. And it is, and one can always remain hopeful that the particular constitutional choice the courts have made for the time being are not there forever. They can change. And this, for all of you as lawyers, you never know which side of the argument you are going to represent. But the first important thing would be that there would always be something to say about a point of view you are supposed to propound. And in that context, today we are talking of the judicial review in terms of its dynamism, in terms of the process, the way the whole thing changed. And I also want to be very clear that we are also not here to criticize an active court or a passive court. because all these criticisms contradict each other. Because if the courts are very active, there's always a criticism that the judicial activism is on a rise, and if the courts are not deciding according to some people what it should decide, then there's a criticism that the courts are being very passive. We're also not here to discuss what is a liberal court and what is a illiberal court, or what are the personality oriented issues and what are the institutional oriented issues. We are here to discuss the whole process of judicial review. Now, first there is, it is said that for Supreme Court, and this is one of the very important, prominent judges of the United States Supreme Court, who says that we are not final because we are infallible, but we are infallible only because we are final. Now, this is a very important facet of judicial review, that the courts are final, but only final for the time being. So, say in our country, the Supreme Court of India is final, but it is final for the time being, because it itself can change its view over the period, and therefore what is the finality is final for the time being, and this fallible finality comes with plethora of choices, alternate visions, and dynamic changes of views, with reversals, reiterations, and the equivocation. And this is the beauty of the process, that it keeps on changing and keep on taking a different route. And this is what we are going to discuss today. Now, before we go to that, I would like to discuss the next slide, how the judicial review has evolved in a constitutional court. Now, this has a relation with the history of the Western democracies. And in my slide, I've put these 4 or 5 pointers. So this is the Magna Carta of 1215, which was first used prominently by a very prominent judicial philosopher, legal philosopher and jurist, in a judgment called Dr. Bonham, in which he says that even the nation's parliament, supreme in all legal matters, pass laws that invaded fundamental rights, and there has to be a check on that. Now, this is way back in 1610. So this is how there. Then you have this very interesting treatise by Montesquieu, who wrote this wonderful treatise called Spirits of Law, and there he described the necessity of in the Western democracies, you had the monarchies and the princes ruling, against whom the nobles and the people of the people around them were always sort of resisting their power, and they wanted that there should be some kind of a check on the power they use, or a monarchical power, because it can be totally whimsical, totally arbitrary, and can ride roughshod over the basic rights of the people. So you have this evolution of Privy Council, which later became a judicial body. Then you have the House of Lords, which also became a judicial body. So they realized that over the period, that it is the judicial branch which should must have a kind of a very a break on the arbitrary and unchecked power of the monarch. And so Montesquieu writes in his Spirit of Laws that it is to provide, if it is to provide its citizens with great possible liberty, a government must have certain features. So first, a constant experience shows that every man invested with power is apt to abuse it. It is necessary from every nature of things, very nature of things, that power should be check to power. And therefore, what they say is that when it comes to a government, it is only the power which can check a power. And this is achieved through the separation of executive legislative power of government. And if different persons or bodies exercise these powers, then each can check the other if they try to abuse their power. But if one person or body holds several or all of these powers, then nothing prevents that person or body from acting tyrannically, and the people will have no confidence in their own security. Now, this is a thought which has been sort of growing in the monarchical system of the Western societies, and and this has been very graphically put by John Adams in 1776 in his famous treatise called Thoughts on Government. So what he says is that a representation of people in one assembly being obtained, a question arises whether all the powers of government, legislative, executive, and judicial, shall be left in this body. I think that people cannot be long free, nor ever happy, whose government is in one assembly. And my reasons for these opinions are as follows. Number one, a single assembly is liable to all the vices, follies, and frailties of the individuals, subject to fits of the humor, start of the passion, flights of enthusiasm, partialities or prejudices, and consequently productive of hasty results and absurd judgments. And all these errors ought to be corrected and defects supplied by some controlling power. Then second, a single assembly is apt to be avaricious, and in time will not scruple to exempt itself from burdens which will lay without compunction on its constituents. Now, this is a very medieval kind of English, but the thought that if you put one power in one institution, so even when you transition from a monarchical system to democracy, but if all the people are to run government, or if only one organ is there to look after all the affairs of the state, it can create a lot of, it will be a kind of a substitution of monarchy or the arbitrariness or the absolute power of a king into that single body. And therefore, over the period, this thought emerged that in a good democracy, you have to have a republican system. That is, that it is not that the people govern directly, but they govern through elected representative and the institution. And among those institutions, there are three arms, that is the legislature, which makes the laws, the executive, which executes them, and the judiciary, which decides. And Thomas puts it very graphically that a representative assembly, though extremely well qualified and absolutely necessary as a branch of legislative, is unfit to exercise the executive power, and for want of two essential properties, secrecy and dispatch. And then he says that so a judiciary, a legislature which is elected cannot run a government. At the same time, he says that a representative assembly is still less qualified for judicial power because it is too numerous, too slow, and too little skilled in laws. So you imagine that your MPs or MLAs deciding some property dispute or some constitutional matter or some legal matter, validity of a law which they have enacted. So they also can't do this judicial work. So therefore, in a republican state or in a democratic republic, you have to have basically these three branches or the three arms of the state, that is the legislature, executive, and judiciary. And this is how the Article 6 in the US Constitution was uh, uh, incorporated in the famous assembly of the in Pennsylvania and the Constitution which came into effect from 1778. And it says that this Constitution and the laws of United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in constitutional laws or any state or the to the contrary notwithstanding. So therefore, they gave supremacy to Constitution and the laws under the Constitution, but the validity of those laws have to be then decided by the judges only, and that is part of the judicial review. So this is how the judicial review, and in the famous case of Marbury versus Madison in US, this idea was very strongly established that it is the Supreme Court or the judicial review which can override the validity of a law enacted by the legislature or validity of an executive action which is outside the boundary of the law. And unless you have some institution which can be check on the other institution like the legislature or the executive, it can sometimes become very one-sided, and what is popularly said that the transient majorities in a democracy can sometimes overtake, and to the detriment of the society in general, and particularly the minority or the people who are not part of the ruling dispensation. Now, so this is a thought of a democratic republic with three arms of the state having separation of power, and each arm of the state having a healthy tension, and at the same time having a kind of a check and balance against the other institution. And this was a fairly well evolved idea by the time India India got independence and was in the process of drafting a constitution in the Constituent Assembly. Now, before our independence, we had the judicial review. It was mainly of the inter partes dispute, or the state was involved when there was a taxation dispute or some criminal case. But but after the independence, we became a welfare state, a democratic republic, and our courts, you have thousands and thousands of cases in high courts and Supreme Court where the citizens claim certain fundamental rights. Sometimes they get affirmed, sometimes they get defeated, but that's a different story. So this is how the judicial review is now part of the basic structure of the Constitution as it was described in Keshwanand Bharti's case. And I will come to how this thing has evolved post-independence. So we have now, consistent with the Western democracies, the democratic republic, the three prominent arms of the state, legislature, executive, and judiciary. There's a separation of power. There's a check and balance. There's a healthy tension between them, and have a constitution which is often described as a living and organic document. The last one was in Puttaswamy, where the Supreme Court was considering another very unique concept, which was so far there, but lying dormant as a judicial concept of the privacy. And now the next slide is about how in India, the judicial review became one of the basic features of the Constitution. So, in one of the first cases in India is of the Shankari Prasad, where the Supreme Court a constitution bench, of course, took a view that an amendment to constitution is not a law as we understand in Article 13 of the Constitution. And therefore, it is not open to judicial review. You can amend the constitution in the way you like. And then came the other judgment of Sajjan Singh, again a constitution bench, which said that the fundamental rights can be amended. This is because the constitution is enacted by a constituent assembly, which was an elected body. Now it is succeeded by another elected body, which is the constituent body in that sense, and it can always amend the constitution, including the fundamental rights, and it would not be open to judicial review. Then came Golaknath, where it was a bench of 11 judges, and in a 6-7, it was a very narrow margin in that sense. The Supreme Court overruled both Shankari Prasad and Sajjan Singh and held that an amendment to constitution is open to judicial review like any other enactment of the legislation, and that the fundamental rights cannot be amended at all. Now, you have to understand that this was a period when in India, the new republic and the government was having a series of land reform legislations where the old power structure and the old landholders, landlords were being deprived of the land, and the land was being given to the tillers. And this was a very big debate. And the Supreme Court at that time was being criticized for being a court of the landlords. And this judgment also, so you see first the court says the constitutional amendment not open to judicial review, you can even amend fundamental rights. And then come the another extreme view that constitutional amendment can also be judicially reviewed and fundamental rights cannot even be amended. And then came Keshwanand Bharti, which overruled Golaknath only in part, and it's a very important distinction, and they say that constitution can be amended, but not the basic structure. And what is basic structure, and whether it is in the whether a given amendment is permissible within the basic structure, that only through a judicial review it can be decided. And in this case, one of the fundamental rights, that is the right to property under 19(1)(f), that amendment was that fundamental right was completely abrogated, and now you have only Article 300A, not a fundamental right but a constitutional right that nobody shall be deprived of property without authority of law. But otherwise, earlier there was a big dispute, and the constitutional amendment can also be subjected to judicial review, and if it is transgressing the basic structure, the courts can strike down. And you have one recent example where the provision for NJSE, the constitutional amendment was struck down by Supreme Court on the ground that this kind of a body would interfere with the independence of judiciary, and the independence of judiciary is essential, basic part, one of the features of the basic structure of constitution, and it can't be amended like this. And then you have this immediately after Keshwanand Bharti, or about 7-8 years after that, there was this Minerva Mill case in which Article 31C was amended, which said that any law which gives effect to any of the directive principles of the Constitution, it can't be subject to judicial review. You can't decide the validity of those laws. And the Supreme Court said that no, this can't be permitted, because then it would be a license to make any law and relate it to any of the directive principles. And those directive principles are so broad and so open to so many interpretations that, so then the parliament can make any law and the courts can't really have any judicial review of that. So, so this is how the judicial review has now become a part of our basic structure. Now, we go to the next slide. What are the features of the judicial power? Because when we are dealing with judicial review, we must understand that it comes in what context or with what features. So number one is that the judges are not subject to election but appointed by nomination. Now, you know, the different countries have different processes of nomination, but the fact remains that they are not the people who have to seek some popular acceptance or some kind of a vote for their being elevated. So, and they would not have any kind of of a compulsion to answer to a gallery or a vote bank or a constituent of their supporters. Then most of the jurisdictions in judicial review, the independence is assured by security of tenure and removal only by impeachment. So in America and so many Western democracies, the judges are appointed for life or maybe up to the age of 80 years because they believe that more mature the judge, better the outcome, etc., etc. But still, to the extent the tenure is granted in the constitution, it is secure. And one in our country also, a judge of a high court or Supreme Court can be removed only by impeachment. That is, when a parliament by 2/3 majority passes a resolution on a proven misconduct, etc. And which is a long process. And it's the beauty of the whole system that so far we have had 2 aborted cases of impeachment, but no successful case of impeachment of any judge. Now, the third important feature is that most the judges would have a background of jurist, lawyer, or a judge. So it ensures a kind of intellectual debate, intellectual resolution, and somebody who is well versed in the tenets of the law, the rule of law, etc., and the constitutional values. And then the other feature is that the judges only decide a live inter-party dispute or a live list between the parties. So today you have this pandemic. So the judge, it is not judge's job to start doing something for the pandemic, but they can decide only the issues which arise between a citizen and a state or between the citizens. So they can only decide the live dispute. Now their accountability is to the constitution, rule of law, and the conscience. So they are not, as I said earlier, that they are not there to seek approval from their voters or whatever. Now, for the judicial power, there are so many areas which are totally off limit, like economy. You know, so in India we had the socialist or the state control economy. Then we shifted to more liberal economic policy, etc. But all these are not for the judicial power or a judicial review to decide what is good or what is bad for the country. This, or if there has to be a war, or there are some diplomatic challenges. In fact, there was a very old case, I forget the name. In America, the president asked the US Supreme Court, this was sometime in 1800, that there are conflicting powers in Europe. So like France was at war with Portugal or something. Now what should be our relation and what should be our stand with them? And the Supreme Court said that we have no way to advise you. You do whatever you want to do at your diplomatic level. So, and likewise, this judicial power, there is no policy initiative. So you can't, like I said, pandemic or economic policy, or maybe some areas to be industrialized, some areas to be kept. So these are the policy matters. The judicial review would not be concerned with that, nor the judicial review or the judicial power would have execution machinery. Because see, if there is a judgment which is passed, and if some party is recalcitrant not to enforce it or not to accept the verdict, it is the state machinery which is used again to implement the judgment. And also the judges or the judicial power has no political agenda. So you don't have the party politics in that traditional sense. And the primary duty is to check against the abuses by the other organs of the state. And that is why you have this plethora of cases where, like recently, Supreme Court struck down the amendment in the Arbitration Act, or upheld the amendment whereby the property owners are made party, are given a locus in a building project and things like that. So it has to judge the limit or the validity of the power exercised by legislature or the executive, but and act as a bulwark or a check as to protect the interest of the citizens. And the Supreme Court or the judicial, the highest court in any judicial system, is the final arbiter. And as it is said that Constitution means what the Supreme Court says it means. Now this is what is said in American context, but this is also true in our context also. That today, if you say that I read a particular article like this, and somebody says I read particular article like that, now the debate with reference to a live issue would ultimately be settled only by Supreme Court, and this is why it is very popularly said that the Constitution means what the Supreme Court says it means. Now we come to the various facets of the judicial review. That is, all constitutional amendments are subject to judicial review. So the judicial review can, as we have discussed earlier, Minerva Mills case, the constitutional amendment to Article 31C, and it was restored to only protecting the laws to give effect to 29B and C. 39B and C, that is about the distribution of economic resources. Then even the actions of the high constitutional functionaries like the Speaker of the Assembly or the Lok Sabha or the President or the Governor are subject to judicial review. So you have these cases under the 10th schedule where the Speaker decides or not decide whether the particular MLA is disqualified for being for defection, or there may be other issues like the Keshav Singh's case, where the question was about punishing a journalist for the alleged contempt of the Assembly. And so all that is subject to judicial review. And the President and the Governor, so 356, this is the imposition of the President's rule in a state. Now this is also subject to judicial review. So there is nothing, the parameters for judicial review may differ, but the fact remains that all these high constitutional functionaries, their action can also be subject to judicial review. Then we all know that all legislative enactments are subject to judicial review. Then all tribunals, adjudicatory bodies are subject to Article 32, 226, 227, which cannot substitute Supreme Court and High Court because they are the essential integral part of the judicial review. So now, here again, earlier the Supreme Court in Sampath Kumar took the view that all these tribunals, they need not be subject to the jurisdiction of the High Court. But ultimately in L. Chandra Kumar's 7-judge bench, and in my opinion rightly so, held that no, this is the high prerogative writs of the High Court and of the Supreme Court under Article 32. They are part of the integral part of the judicial review and therefore part of the basic structure of the Constitution, and nobody can tinker with that in any manner. And then all administrative actions are subject to judicial review. You all do it every day under Article 14 and 19 and this and that. And then this is our very peculiar feature of our jurisdiction, our country, that PIL, locus and procedures are now so relaxed that they facilitate easy access to judicial review. So there can be a public interest litigation on any topic. You have now this flood of corona-related petitions all over, sometimes in public interest, sometimes in publicity interest, but that's again a different topic. But the fact remains that the access to judiciary is. Now we come to these some of these interesting choices which the judicial review made. So you have this case of NAS Foundation. This was decided in 2009, where the Supreme Court, where the High Court, Delhi High Court, said that we declare this Section 377 of IPC is violative of Article 14, 15, and 21, insofar as it criminalizes the consensual sexual act of two adults in private. Now, this judgment was reversed by the Supreme Court in 2014. And the Supreme Court at that time took two interesting, accepted two very interesting arguments. One was that there is a Law Commission report, and it is for the legislature to decide. Why should Supreme Court get into this value judgment of whether LGBT relations are desirable or not? Let the Parliament take the call. And the second interesting argument was that for last 150 years, there are hardly few cases which can be in the one single digit. So why interfere? And this, in 2018 in Navtej Johar, a 5 judges bench, and there are 4 opinions, and I've just quoted from one, that all these arguments and so many other arguments were negative. And the court said that, whether Law Commission has considered or not considered, and the government is accepting and not accepting, it's a neutral fact. We are not really concerned with that. We have to decide the constitutionality. And then they said that all this history of the 150 years and only less than 200 cases is neither here nor there. And this is how you see the constitutional choices keep on changing. Now see the other instance. In the next slide, you have this judgment about the adultery. So Section 497 of IPC, it was upheld by Supreme Court, a 5 judges judgment, which is almost half a page, which are 4 or 5 paragraphs, very short paragraphs, which if it is printed on one side of the page, it will not cover even the half a page. And the Supreme Court took the view that sex itself is a basis for sound classification, and they said that this is a special provision for protection of the women. And this whole argument or these submissions are in Joseph's time in 2019 are sort of lambasted, and the Supreme Court has recognized the sexual autonomy and privacy even in adultery. And they say that it may be a moral wrong, it may entail some civil consequences, but you can't make it criminal. And therefore, Section 497 is held to be completely unconstitutional in 4 separate concurring opinions. Now you see the shift, 1954 and 2019. Earlier, 2014 and 2019, the shift. Now see the other instance. The Sabrimala judgment of 5 judges was given in 2019, or I think September 2019. And after a year, I think it was in September 2018 and then reported in 19. And after a year in 2019, November 19, it has been referred to a larger bench. Now, in the main judgment, it was a majority of 4:1, and it is now that majority has changed. The minority became 3 and the majority became 2, and it has now been referred to a larger bench. So this is how the fungible or the dynamic nature of the constitutional choices is. Now, with all this, and in a society where there are so many debatable issues, contested points of views, so there's a constant attempt to limit the scope of judicial review, because and this is to a large extent it is part of a healthy tension, because each organ of the state wants to have its final say in the matter, because it is answerable to particular set of constituents or the mandate it has. So there are from time to time constitutional amendments. So one we have discussed, that 42nd amendment, which said that you cannot have a judicial review of the constitutional amendment. Now this would have given a complete power to the parliament to make whatever provision in the constitution. Attempts, or there was a attempt by introducing the provision for NJAC, which ultimately Supreme Court said that no, this constitutional amendment cannot pass first term. Then there is a attempt to limit judicial review by the appointment process. Now, in this, what happens is that the courts try to the government tries to sort of regulate the appointment, or they have the supersessions, or they have the transfers, with a view to pack the judiciary with the judges they would like, or they think that they would propound their point of view or toe their line of governance. Now, so this is another way of limiting the judicial review. Then there is curtailment of liberties. So you have these cases under Article 21, 22 about the preventive detentions, which are so preventive detention is one of the major classic example of the curtailment of the liberties. Of course, at times it is done for good reasons, against a smuggler or for the public peace, etc. But the kind of mechanism which is evolved, and then there are laws to regulate or restrict the judicial review. So you have the one extreme example of a constitutional amendment by which certain act is put in the 9th schedule of the Constitution, which bars a judicial review. Now, in Coelho's case, the Supreme Court said that when you put some act in a 9th schedule to make it beyond the pale of judicial review, that itself is subject to judicial review. And if it is made for some wrong reason, it can. But the legislatures from time to time keep on sending the act to the 9th schedule to make it immune from the judicial review. Then there's also a very interesting facet of judicial review, that judges have certain self-restraint because they don't like to get into. So now we had this demonetization and there were a spate of petitions. And the judges said that we don't want to get into this minefield of economic legislation or the economic activity, and they restrain. And so far, they have not decided to decide the matter. And then there are some other reasons, there are gossips and fictions and reality. And I leave it to your imagination that why sometimes the courts behave the way they are behaving. And then the judicial review also has a certain excesses attached to it. Now, so you have at times a judiciary making legislation. Now, Vishaka is one a classic example where, with of course, with all good intention, the Supreme Court made regulations for regulating the incidents of sexual harassment in workplaces, both in private and government. And ultimately, after 7-8 years, the government came out with an enactment. But the fact remains that and there are so many instances like this where the judicial, in the process of judicial review, there is a kind of a judicial legislation. Now, again, we are not getting into the debate of desirable, undesirable, but these are treated as the excesses of the judicial review. So now, I was on this excesses of judicial review, and I was on this adverse economic impact. So there's a criticism that, matters like 2G license, where and the coal allocation, where the coal blocks which were allocated 20 years back or 25 years back, they were also sort of set aside, and it had the enormous impact on the banks who had lended the money to the industries to whom the coal blocks were allotted. So and even the 2G license also had affected the telecom industry very badly. Then there is another criticism, or one of the excesses of judicial review is that they sometimes create an independent power structure. So you have instances of court monitored investigation carried on from time to time. Now, one of the classic case of Hawala, which started this court monitored investigation, where the charge sheet was filed almost every prominent politician in the country. And at the charge stage, ultimately the Supreme Court set aside all the criminal proceedings, and they said that even the charge can be framed. So you have this whole enormous amount of investigation, everyday publicity. I was on the last point of the excess of judicial review.
Right, sir.
So now heroism of judges, and to illustrate this point, we have this very interesting example from the Pakistan. So one Chief Justice, Iftikhar Chaudhry, he was being called as a Khalifa judge because he had taken suo motu cognizance in 6,000 matters, 6,000 cases. He said, took a suo motu cognizance, and in the process set aside so many international agreements which the Pakistan had with the other private or the other governments, or he took up the cases against the private medical colleges, etc. So 6,000 suo motu cases, and he was Chief Justice from 2005 to 13. Then ultimately he had a big fight with Pervez Musharraf, who was the president at that time, who removed him as Chief Justice, and then ultimately Pervez Musharraf was removed and he was restored, etc. And he was followed by another very colorful successor called Chief Saqib Nisar, who called himself like a Baba Rahmat, so a great man of charity and piousness and this and that. And he wanted to collect money to construct a dam, one of his favorite dam, which required some 1,500 crore of rupees. And he was able to collect 9 crore of rupees. And this he would do by taking suo motu cognizance in some matter. And then people come and give some charity. And then he would sort of do the rafa dafa of those cases and things like that. And in the end, it appears that at his son's wedding, almost he was able to collect ultimately only 9 crore of rupees. And his son's wedding was very extravagant, some 2-3 crores were spent, and people were talking about. So you also have this kind of in our country there have been some lesser heroes. So a judge who sort of took cognizance of contempt against a ticket collector or on a railway station, etc. But that is more for laughter. But this is much more serious. What happened in Pakistan. Now, I would now conclude my talk and would be open to question with this thought that this Justice William Douglas was one of the very prominent judge of the US Supreme Court, and he was on the bench for almost 35 years or more. And one of his, there are two very interesting books he has written. One is the Go East Young Man. So he was from west coast of America, and those days it was very popular for the people from west to go to east for better opportunities. So that is his autobiography kind of, and this is the memoirs of the court. And he says that on the very first day, when he was sitting, that Chief Justice on that day, he tells him that you must remember one thing, that at the constitutional level we work, 90% of any decision is emotional. The rational part of us supplies the reasons for supporting our predilections. Now, this is a very interesting thought. What he meant was that at this level, we decide the cases emotionally, by the gut reaction, by what we feel is correct. And then you have a lot of principles to support your judgment. So you can have a kind of, what is the intent of the constitution maker, or what is the purposive construction, or what is the intent, or what is the evil which is sought to be addressed. So all these things you then supply when you want to take a decision in this or in that manner. But you first emotionally decide, or you have your gut reaction that this is what. So you have a case, say on privacy or say on adultery, and you say that no, this can't be permitted. And then you hear the argument, and then you articulate your reasoning in a way that your conclusion. Now this is the judge who is saying this, and he was one of the very well respected and a very articulate judge of the American Supreme Court, that we decide. And this is how the seesaw goes on in the constitutional choices the court make. And in that seesaw, you as lawyers, as budding lawyers, you must be always hopeful that there would always be something to say about your point of view.
So guys, we are almost closing the session now. Now we will need you to have your queries addressed by sir, so we can have the queries in the chat now. I have received some 8 or 10 for now. So yeah, your queries can be related to anything around the topic that we are talking about.
We'll be taking these queries shortly, so it's just rejoining. Till then, you can perhaps take a couple of minutes to sort of frame your questions, if there are any. We believe, as Raghav said, that we have received some. I've also gotten some privately from people on Facebook, etc., who haven't been able to join the Zoom meeting. So we'll be taking all of those. Right, I believe Sir is back. So could you switch on your video, please? We're not able to see you. Perfect, sir. We can see you now. So are you audible?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect, sir. So you kind of dropped off there in the middle. You were discussing Justice Douglas's quote, and in the perspective of issues, contemporary issues about what you feel, such as like privacy and adultery, etc. I believe that's where you sort of dropped off. Could you continue?
So my concluding thought is that the judicial review throws constitutional choices which keep on changing, because the society, the judges, the court they also keep on changing, and there's nothing like a final word. And to think that this can be one exercise our friends can do on their own, that you take any of the cases decided by a Supreme Court and just consider that why it can't, what if it was decided other way around. So suppose 377 was decided the way it was decided in the Cautions case, even by the Constitution bench. So what would have been the arguments, what would have been the controversy? And it is just possible that after 10 years, the Supreme Court can may change the view. Or so there's nothing like a final view. It is final for the time being. And this is a constant dynamic process where views and the judicial opinion keep on changing. And that's the nature of judicial review. Now, with this, I would conclude my thought, and I must say that one advantage of this kind of interaction is that you are heard very quietly. There is no disturbance to you, except the technical glitch. So I'm now open to questions. Any of our friends want to ask him?
Right, so we have received some questions. I'll just start with the first one, which is from Nirja on Facebook. Raghav, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I'll have to just scroll up a little.
Right, so let's just start with the first one. It's Nirja's question is, do the judgments in the Shankari Prasad case and the Sajjan Singh case have the same ruling, which is that can fundamental rights be amended by the legislature?
No, the Shankari Prasad and they took the view that yes, fundamental rights can be amended. That was in the second case. This was I 1 minute. Shankari Prasad is the second one. No? First one. Sajjan Singh is the so Sajjan Singh is the case in which they said that the fundamental rights can be amended, because that was the issue there. And the other, the Shankari Prasad was relating to some, I think, first or the 13th Amendment, which, of course, see, as I told you that we are not on the merits of the matter. We are on the judicial process where things keep on changing. So if you want consultation or academic discussion, we can have it on a separate occasion.
Absolutely.
So what the cases are deciding is not the point. The point is about the changes which are taking place from time.
Right, sir. So in that light, we have a question from Priyanshi, which says that if a petition gets filed in the Supreme Court seeking directions to be issued to the government of India to impose sanctions on China for the violation of international treaties and conventions, I believe that this is sort of perhaps in the current context of the pandemic, could this sort of petition be under the purview of a judicial review? Because according to her, a policy matter cannot be reviewed by the Supreme Court. Is that correct?
No, you see, this is again a very question which would, according to me, open to very big debate. So there are 2-3 principles here. One is about the sanctity or the constitutional mandate of an international treaty. So now all the international treaties are treated as part of the law. There are some judgments also, and there are some provisions also. And at the same time, to tell the government of India to take action against a foreign country, now it will be a debate whether such kind of a mandamus can be issued or not. It is open to debate, according to me. And a lot of assumptions about China or against China, they are also open to debate. So all these things are a kind of Pandora's box. But our topic today is about the nature of judicial review. So it can be entertained by an active court. It may not be entertained by an active court. The petitioner may get relief, may not get relief. this is again making only the point that judicial review is always so open and so fungible.
Fair enough. So thank you. Sir, I've received another question separately from Anurag. I believe he's still on the call. His question is, as far as court-monitored investigations are concerned, the Supreme Court in a matter called Girish Kumar Saneja extinguished the power of revision of high courts that lay against orders on charge, holding that this provision is misused by accused persons for delays. And as mentioned by you during your presentation, L. Chandrakumar upheld the power of the High Court under Article 226 against the decision of tribunals running contrary to the speedy disposal purpose of tribunals. Isn't this dichotomy actually running against the remedies of a person accused of criminal office, which itself is a facet of Article 21?
You see, there are so many concepts are mixed up here. What exactly our friend wants to know is perhaps that, when a court is monitoring investigation, the principle is that it only sees the process, but it doesn't impinge on any judicial power or the powers of the lower court, which may have to be exercised at various stages of the criminal proceedings. So I don't think this is his correct reading of the judgment, that if Supreme Court is monitoring investigation, the High Court would not have revision power, or the lower court would not have revision power. It will all depend on so many things. And Chandra Kumar is again, I mean, in the criminal proceedings, I'm not able to see the connection of Chandra Kumar with the criminal proceedings.
All right, sir. So we have another question from Nivedita, who is asking directly about the topic at hand today. She's asking, how do we differentiate between judicial activism and judicial overreach? Isn't judicial activism a necessary evil when the legislators throw away their, they shove the responsibility away from themselves?
You see, that's why I put it in my disclaimer that we are not getting into the criticism or the praise of judiciary for activism or pacifism or whatever, because these are all very subjective matters, and these are all matters of personal opinions. Because sometimes, the judges are criticized for being overactive, and sometimes the judiciary is criticized for abstaining from doing what it is supposed to do. So again, there is no answer which is absolute answer in a situation like this. These are all matters of more of very subjective and personal opinion matters.
Understood, sir. So one question that I had was, so in the Speedy Bills case of 1978 and then in S.R. Bomai, the court held that, whether or not a question is of a political nature is not relevant. And what they should really concern themselves with is the fact that even if the question itself may be of a political nature currently, the bills or any provisions from which it is stemming must not be constitutionally invalid. So do you think that this principle is still, could you expand upon the sort of this principle a little more in contemporary times? And do you secondly feel that this principle is still being followed as it should be? Or if you could, if you could just generally take a critique of this?
Very good question. Let me just tell you 2-3 things. In the state of Rajasthan case, where the validity of the dissolution of the assemblies of the states, where the Janata governments were there, and Indira Gandhi imposed after. So the government at the center was different and the state it was different, and because the central government elections were won by one party, they dissolved the assemblies of the states of the opposition parties. Now, one of the arguments which at that time Supreme Court accepted was what is called political thicket. So the court said that we don't get into political thicket and decide what are essentially political questions. But then in Bomai's case, that has been reversed. And what they say is that this is a matter of high privilege or a high prerogative of the president or the governor, but at the same time, if it is so malicious or so arbitrary, then it is open to judicial review. And they say that malicious not in the personal sense, but what is called in law a malice in law. So if it is not conforming to a certain standards which are laid down, that is that if you have a elected majority for 5 years, just because that majority is not vindicated in some other election, you don't have to dismiss that government. That is not the criteria to invoke 356. And then they also laid down certain checks about the subsequent ratification by Lok Sabha so that there is a full debate and it is done in an open and a transparent manner. And that is why you will find that after Bommai, there is hardly invocation of Article 356. And whenever it is done, like in Bihar case, they restored the dissolved assembly. And so therefore those principles are very much there. It is the application of those principles, but they had a very salutary effect that you don't have now very frequent invocation of Article 356 and dismissal of the validly elected state governments.
All right, sir. Thank you so much.